Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Two stories that don't initially seem to be related, but at second glance they're almost inextricably intertwined, and it's all about how much credibility you afford to people making accusations of sexual abuse. You know, one of my party tricks at the moment when people are defending, you know, banter, locker room talk, oh, it's just a bit of fun. Oddly, the kind of people who seem comfortable with low-level sexual abuse and misogyny, when you just suggest that, would you hold the same view if the people doing that, if the people at the President's Club were brown and or Muslim? It's amazing how quickly they go quiet and their tiny little brains explode. But the story I'm drawn to today is also about how two scenarios that admit similar questions provide completely different answers depending on where you're sitting when the question is asked. 5 minutes after 10 is the time, because if you don't believe people coming forward, and the word believe is difficult in these circumstances, because it can't be a fact or a matter of record until a conviction has actually been secured. So when I say to you, when John Warboy's victims weren't believed, when many of them were told that they were not believable, I heard an interview with one of them this morning that still resonated not just with the horror of the crime, but also with the horror of the response from the authorities, specifically in words told that she was not believable because she wasn't crying and stressed enough in the interviews, and that was why in her case the prosecution didn't go forward. So that can happen when you don't believe. I'd refer you to the grooming gangs in the north of England as well. Anyone who's even flicked through the official reports into those scandals will know that the girls, the young women who were not believed or not considered worthy of protection because of their status in society, children from care, children from very poor backgrounds, children with chaotic histories, somehow that means they get treated differently from people from different backgrounds. So that's what happens when you don't believe people. Crimes go unpunished. But when you do afford credibility to people who subsequently perhaps turn out not to, and again, there haven't actually been any convictions yet or anything like that, when you do afford credibility to people who are making very serious allegations, and then those allegations turn out not to be true, you end up with the opposite problem, in that the people against whom the allegations have been levelled have been punished. They have been found guilty, if you will, until proven innocent. And that I don't know how you square these two strands. I genuinely don't. I do think that it's the polar opposite of the conversations we normally have together, where I like to insist that experience is more valuable than opinion. I think the law is the opposite of that rule, you know. I was thinking about this last night. Because if you had just been accused and you were innocent, I suspect that your experience would lead you to a very different opinion from the one of somebody who has just been abused and not believed. So the law's job, of course, and we forget this, particularly in the kind of increasingly febrile public space where, as I keep describing and reality keep proving, it's just teams now. It's got nothing to do with qualities or arguments or positions. You just pick a team and stick furiously to actually spending more time shouting abuse at the other side than you do to justifying or explaining your own position. So in that world, the law, the rule of law, is so important. And the rule of law is about proof and precedent. So what do we do? I honestly don't know, because if somebody came forward now accusing me of having raped them, then I would find it horribly unfair that he or she remains anonymous, despite being a liar, while my name gets dragged through the mud. We went in quite hard on the Nick story, on elements of it. I think we kind of began to step back when he started accusing Harvey Procter of murder. We didn't report that, I don't believe. But our job as journalists is to report things. And this was a story involving allegations being made by somebody who, as we observed at the time, was either telling the truth or had gone to extraordinary lengths to concoct this story, and which way you go on that is the same as the War Boys story. It's only with 20/20 hindsight you can turn around and say, well, I should have believed her and I should have believed him, and I shouldn't have believed her and I shouldn't have believed him. So in terms of what the system should do, I honestly don't know this morning. Because if this fella Nick, and he hasn't been proven to be anything yet, but I think we can safely say, and to be honest with you, my law for journalists is a bit shaky on this kind of ground, but it would appear to me to be clear that many of the things he accused many people of seem highly unlikely to have been true, but journalism is about reporting the allegations. And when I found myself approaching this story 2 or 3 years ago, I appreciate this is very boring for some people, for the majority of people listening, but if you were listening to the programme 2 or 3 years ago, before the audience doubled, you'll know we went in very hard on this story, and I still think it was the right thing to do, even if it turns out that this man wasn't telling the truth, because, well, I'll play you that clip again. This is a chap called Tim Fortescue. Can we play the whole clip? Have we got the whole thing? This is a chap called Tim Fortescue, who was a whip in the Conservative whip's office under Ted Heath's leadership and premiership. So this is a prominent senior Conservative MP and whip. The whip, forgive me if I'm teaching you how to suck eggs, but the whips are the people who effectively ensure that the MPs toe the party line. So if you've got an MP who is demonstrating a little bit of independence of thought or a tendency to rebel against the party leadership, then what the whips will often do is apply the thumbscrews, metaphorically speaking. Indeed, there have been accusations of physical intimidation in the past, but the bottom line here is that the whips use anything to get the MPs to fall into line. And I still think, honestly, I don't know how silly you think this makes me sound, I still think this clip should be played out on a news bulletin once a week in this country, because these people about whom he speaks, particularly the people who, when he spoke about them, then were, quote, small boys, end quotes, they're still alive.
Anyone with any sense who was in trouble would come to the whips and tell them the truth and say, no, I'm in a jam, can you help? It might be debt, it might be a scandal involving small boys, or any kind of scandal which a member seemed likely to be mixed up in. They'd come and ask if we could help. And if we could, we did. And we would do everything we can, because we would store up brownie points. That sounds a pretty nasty reason, but it's one of the reasons. Is if we can get a chap out of trouble, then he'll do as we ask forevermore.
It's 11 minutes after 10, and if you've never heard that clip before, I presume that, unless I am genuinely constructed of somehow different DNA from everybody else, I presume you're reeling from that. A whip describing how the sexual abuse of young boys by MPs, in this case Conservatives, but don't for a minute think that this would be confined to one side or the other of the House. The sexual abuse of young boys, small boys, by politicians, essentially described as something which you could cover up in return for brownie points by a member of Ted Heath's whip's office. So if you are struggling, and I never know the difference between people who are genuinely struggling or people who are pretending to struggle for a variety of reasons, if you are struggling to understand why this fellow Nick, as he's known, was treated with credibility, it's precisely because of this backdrop and because of dossiers that disappeared. It's amazing how I hate the phrase mainstream media, and I don't think it would be fair to say right-wing media, but it is absolutely incredible how, if one accuser turns out to be a fantasist, the establishment in this country will use it to essentially spirit away all of the other accusations that have been neither disproved nor denied. Is it Geoffrey Dickens, the Conservative MP, who took a dossier to Leon Britton detailing several instances, nothing to do with this story, and the dossier subsequently disappeared? I just find myself wondering what you think the system should do. And it has to accommodate both of the horrible stories in the news today. It has to accommodate the fact that John Warboys was sent to jail for considerably less time than he should have been. Again, he wasn't convicted of any of the other sexual assaults and rapes of which he's been accused, but we're almost talking as if he definitely did them. That's dangerous. But if he was guilty of a fraction, say half of the crimes he has been accused of, he should have been locked up forever. But they only pursued a relatively small number of prosecutions, which is why he becomes eligible for probation much earlier than people feel. And now people who weren't involved in those prosecutions are seeking civil prosecutions to hopefully see him sanctioned further. As you know, the Mayor of London, Sadiq Khan, and 2 of his alleged victims have brought this case to court. And that's what happens when you don't believe people. If the people named by Nick had been guilty of crimes, then other victims would have come forward. If John Warboys' details had not been released to the public after the first accusations came in, then lots of other victims would not have come forward. How do you square these two stories? Because I can't at the moment. I think if I had to, I'd go with what we've got. 0345 60 60973. I'd say it is awful that men like Harvey Proctor, in this case, have their lives turned upside down by accusations that subsequently turn out not to be true. And I think there is sanction in place to punish people who do this. Perverting the course of justice perhaps would be the most obvious, or simple libel. I don't know enough about the law to state that with confidence. But I think I would rather live in a world where, oh, well, this is it. Crikey, we've got there, isn't it? Would you rather live in a world where innocent people sometimes get temporarily traduced before the truth eventually emerges? Or would you rather live in a world where guilty people go free because accusations are treated with scepticism and a degree, I'm afraid, of cynicism? And I don't know if you can answer that question, which is not necessarily the best way to set up an hour of phone-in radio. At least you're going to try to answer it. Have I got that right? Are we here describing innocent men having their reputations temporarily traduced and permanently damaged versus guilty men not being as robustly or as severely punished as we all feel they should be because accusations against them were not taken seriously or treated as, in that controversial phrase employed by a Metropolitan Police officer, credible and true? So if all of the accusations against John Warboys had been treated as credible and true, he'd have been banged up for hundreds of years, potentially. If the accusations against Leon Britton and Lord Bramwell and Harvey Proctor had not been treated as credible and true, but they turned out to be, then what would have happened? I hope you find this as, what's the word I'm looking for? Yeah, just fascinating and serious, as I do. And I will play you that clip again, because if I had to choose a single item of evidence in support of the idea that child sex abuse, and remember, there are currently men in prison from both of my schools for doing it. Child sex abuse in all sections of society has been endemic for decades, right up to the corridors of the most potent power. I would play that clip from that whip. It's 10:17. And then it is, I think, one of the most thought-provoking questions I've ever asked you. Do we want to live in a society where innocent people can have their reputations traduced and their livelihoods utterly turned upside down, as would appear to have happened? And you have to remember that nothing has been concluded yet and nobody has been convicted of anything, but that would appear to have happened in the case of the man known as Nick. Or do we want to live in a world where people's accusations are not treated as credible and true, and that then leaves the door open to an offender like John Warboys not being brought to justice for the massive majority of his alleged crimes? 0345 6060 973. And don't forget, this is not a Conservative issue. It's just that clip is the only one I've got, and it happens to be a Conservative MP. But Cyril Smith was a Liberal. He was knighted and has subsequently been accused of, pretty close to proved, of all manner of offences. And then you have the Labour MP Greville Janner as well, who has been accused of various crimes. Neither, of course, still alive, so the laws of libel don't apply, and nor, to be fair, does the right of reply in any meaningful sense. But I don't know what's preferable, and I don't know how you're going to decide, but I would like you to try. 0345 60 973 is the number that you need. Robert is in Tring. Robert, what do you think?
I have a bit of a problem getting my head around this whole issue, James. Firstly, because we've seen so much covering up over the years. You took the words out of my mouth, Cyril Smith, Janner. We could go on and list numerous situations, and I can't get my head around that the Metropolitan Police, probably one of the best police forces in the world, are so stupefyingly incompetent that they would have been taken in. I just don't buy the story.
Well, doesn't that depend on... So you're suggesting there's a cover-up behind the cover-up, then, which is... Well, it's a position I've encountered before. I'm not going to poo-poo it or dismiss you, but is it not more the case, as we suggested at the time, that this is so complicated and so... This series of allegations is so... I don't want to use the word sophisticated, but that's the only one I can find, that you were left with concluding either this is an astonishingly detailed... fabrication, or he's telling the truth. It doesn't necessarily have to be the third way, which is that, in your view, he was telling the truth, perhaps, but there's no evidence to back it up, and because they haven't been able to prove it, they're now going to drag him through the courts and over the coals pour encourager les autres, to make sure that other people don't come forward with valid accusations, because they'll see how this guy is completely destroyed. Is that where you are?
I mean, no, we don't want to stop people coming forward. We've got to find a sort of a way through this. But if we cast our minds back to the start of Operation Midland, Theresa May was then the Home Secretary, and she talked in terms of how this would go to the very heart of the establishment.
She did, didn't she? That's been overlooked a bit in a lot of the coverage today.
Yeah, and she was asked on a number of occasions about the Official Secrets Act and allowing police officers, past and present, to come forward and give evidence about situations that they're aware of, and she wouldn't allow that.
And we know also, of course, that Geoffrey Dickens named in the House of Commons, using parliamentary privilege, a former British High Commissioner to Canada. And we also know that he took a dossier to Leon Britton in the early 80s, 83, I think. He spoke of big names, people in positions of power, influence and responsibility. But even if that's true, and what I've just said is true, but even if Geoffrey Dickens's accusations were true, do you not think that some people, possibly myself included, were too ready to treat these? No, I don't think I was, actually, because all you do is report the allegations, and then you would judge their credibility by context, unless you can actually see the evidence. And the context is Geoffrey Dickens and Tim Fortescue.
Indeed. Yeah.
But if it was you, and you were being accused of something, and you knew you hadn't done it, you would presumably oppose the idea that your name should be in the public arena and your accusers shouldn't.
Absolutely.
So where are we then, mate, with respect?
Exactly. This is what your program's all about.
Well, it is, yes.
How do we sort of move through this nightmare? But I mean, I don't know how somebody who's been abused would feel if he subsequently found out 30 years later that these accusations were true, as we often do with the government when they release information. And is there another easy, simple way around this? And it certainly must revolve around the Official Secrets Act. You've got to allow people to come forward, irrespective of how palatable the information they're going to give is. Because
do you know, it's funny you should say that, because in 2015, a file from 1981 was released into the National Archives with the title Security. Sir Peter Heyman, allegations against former public official of unnatural sexual proclivities, security aspects, and that means that Margaret Thatcher had been briefed on this matter before Geoffrey Dickens went public with the allegations in the House of Commons.
Absolutely, and it would be absurd to think that this, as a police operation, was not very, very closely monitored.
It took 34 years to come out, and only then in part. And of course, Sir Peter Heyman was the founder of the Paedophile Information Exchange organisation, which Geoffrey Dickens was campaigning. Conservative MP Geoffrey Dickens, because even now, glancing at the box of trolls, some people are trying to turn this into a party political issue. The Conservative MP Geoffrey Dickens, who campaigned against a suspected paedophile ring, ended up speaking of big names, people in positions of power, influence and responsibility, and then it turns out sort of nearly 40 years after the event that one of those big names was the subject of a briefing given to Margaret Thatcher. Now, I tell you what would be irresponsible. It would now be irresponsible to say the same Margaret Thatcher who regularly spent Christmases with the serial paedophile and sex abuser Jimmy Savile, because I don't think that there is any grounds for suggesting that she may have known. Well, you see why it's not simple? It's 10:28, 0345. Thank you, Robert. 0345 6060973. Thoughtful one, this, isn't it? Because it breaks the golden rules that we try to observe together, which is often on complicated issues. Personal experience is more valued than opinion, but on matters of law, you have to leave personal experience at the door. You can't bring personal experience into this because you couldn't be objective. If you had been named and accused and proven innocent, you would struggle with the idea that your name should remain in the public arena and the name of your accuser should not. But vice versa, if you'd come forward with an accusation and you had been treated like a lot of John Warboys' victims were, and like a lot of the young women in the north of England who were abused and raped and traded like cattle by these grooming gangs, and you came forward to the authorities and got treated with cynicism and scepticism, you'd be equally upset. I would argue a lot, actually maybe that's where I'm going to end it, a lot more upset. What's worse, to be sexually abused, raped, assaulted and not believed so that your miscreants go free, or to be accused of it and found not to be guilty? Oh, I'm going 60-40 with the former, but I don't want to make light of such heavyweight subject matter. If you want to call me, put your position on it. 0345 6060973 is the number that you need. Coming up later in the programme, I'm actually drawn to the Cheddar Man story. Have you seen this? The oldest known inhabitant of this country, 10,000 years old, no less, so-called Cheddar Man, was almost certainly black, which rather puts a cat among the indigenous tribes of Northern Europe pigeons, doesn't it? Although, of course, it won't change anything. And also, the story about Tesco and the pay imbalance. I'm pretty sure, judging by how the producer responded to my early thoughts on this, I'm pretty sure that you're going to tear me a proverbial new one. But I'm not sure Tesco should be in the hole for £4 billion of back pay if they're found to have been paying their staff unequally. I'll explain why later in the programme. Mary's in Oxford. She writes, you really are asking the fundamental question about power and vulnerability. It's as old as humankind, James. The rule of law is all we have, flawed as it is, and I do not think that one-sided anonymity is just, but I do not have an answer. Good luck with this one. Polar opposite of the zeitgeist, really, to accept that there is no right or wrong answer to this question. We just have to decide which one we can live with most comfortably, because as Julian Suffolk reminds us, the lack of a trial or a not guilty verdict doesn't mean that sexual abuse hasn't happened. If we name complainants, then who will ever come forward? That endangers so many more potential victims, and I can't see past that point. And then we move on to the background for believing that an alleged fantasist might have been telling the truth when detailing a VIP paedophile sex ring. Well, you would have to refer to the Leicester Mercury today, which oddly covers a story from a rather different angle to the Sun and the Daily Mail. The Leicester Mercury reports that Greville Janner, who is to be investigated as part of the ongoing child sex abuse inquiry. The inquiry will hear from 33 separate men alleging that Greville Janner, the late Greville Janner, Labour MP, sexually abused them. He was an MP for Leicester. And that's reported in the local newspaper in Leicester today, not reported. In fact, the CSA inquiry is not getting the coverage you'd expect it to get if, like me, you're completely shocked by the clip of the Conservative whip describing using sexual abuse of small boys as brownie points. And then, just to add interest to intrigue, the dossier that I referred to earlier, presented to the then Home Secretary Leon Britton by the then Conservative MP Geoffrey Dickens, disappeared. It was in 2013, after Tom Watson started asking questions around this whole issue, that a Home Office review concluded any information requiring investigation was apparently referred to the police, but it revealed that Mr. Dickens's dossier was, quote, not retained. So imagine if a Conservative MP, in the modern context, okay, you take a Conservative MP, a bit of a maverick, a bit of a campaigner, a bit of a crusader. So I suppose in the modern word would go for Anna Soubry, but she'd be a bad example because people who can't get their blinkers off think that she's somehow not looking out for their interests, bless them. So we'll go for someone go for a Heseltine, shall we? Or I don't know. But anyway, pick your favourite Conservative MP, anyone from Jacob Rees-Mogg to Norman Tebbit to Ken Clarke. Imagine if they went to Amber Rudd and gave her a massive dossier which they claimed, as an elected representative, contained evidence of very serious, high-level, establishment-backed or establishment-covered-up sexual abuse of children. OK, Amber Rudd, Home Secretary, Conservative MP, takes them a dossier. 40 years later, it turns out that the dossier has disappeared. And that I think, is context to this story. But what's worse? Innocent people being publicly accused, or innocent victims seeing their abusers go free. Treat them as credible and true. You run the risk of the front of the Sun and the Mail today describing this Nick person as a serial fantasist. Treat the victims as not credible and true, and you end up having to hear the words of some of John Warboys' victims recalling the moment when the police told them that they weren't believable enough to have charges brought. So you have to pick between the two, and that involves deciding what's worse. A guilty man going free, or an innocent man not going to jail. These aren't convictions and prosecutions. An innocent man being publicly accused. And very, very reluctantly, because as I said right from the outset on this programme, if it was me, I couldn't possibly endorse the idea that I should be publicly accused. I'd hate it. I'd think it was the most unjust and unfair thing imaginable. But it's not as unjust and as unfair as being raped and watching your accuser go free because the authorities have treated you with cynicism and scepticism, like they did with John Warboys, like they did with the grooming gangs in the north of England. What do people actually want? It's almost as if they want a different set of rules according to who is in the metaphorical dock. And then we're back to, well, actually we don't need to today, but we are back to some of the other stories involving sexual abuse of women and sort of entrenched societal misogyny, and the absolutely unavoidable fact that a significant swathe of our population thinks that the rules or the laws should be applied differently to Muslim taxi drivers compared to the President of the United States of America, who faces more accusations of sexual assault than any of the people in the news today, except John Warboys. It's 10:41. Ben is in Salford. Ben, what do you think? Oh, we'll do something about that phone line, Ben. I'll be with you imminently. Nick's in Bristol. Nick, what would you like to say?
Oh, hello, James.
Hello, mate.
I think the reason we're talking about this is because the whole area of sexual offences is so morally... it's such a moral panic.
Yeah.
And
is it? Panic?
It begins and brings down particular shame both for the victims and offenders.
Yes.
All right, so... Obviously, the right to anonymity has to stay for victims because of the shame and humiliation involved, and that applies at every level. So, really, what we're talking about is should alleged offenders have their right be named or not?
Yes.
Now, the main argument for naming an offender, an alleged offender, before conviction is that it'll encourage further victims to bring their complaints forward. Where
Yes. They call it shaking the tree, don't they? Shaking the tree.
Yeah. I believe that the right to anonymity actually should be extended to alleged offenders before conviction, and that where you change the law is that the alleged offender is named even if acquitted. So they would be named if convicted, but also identified if acquitted. In that case, any further victims of a serial offender, and most of them would be serial offenders given the nature of sexual offences, would then have their cue and their chance to come forward in turn. So you separate out the cases.
Except that often the cases that when people get named, the case strengthens with every person that comes forward. The likelihood of a conviction increases.
True that, but you would have one canary in the coal mine. Okay, if he's acquitted, he's acquitted. Nobody comes forward, then there was nothing there.
What would that do that the current system?
Yes. Been acquitted, then there must be more that could come, and then they could be dealt with as a batch and investigated.
Well, but what does that do that the current system doesn't do?
It protects the anonymity of somebody who is genuinely innocent.
Well, no, because you can never know that they're genuinely innocent. All you can do is conclude that they haven't been convicted, they haven't been found guilty. You can't really prove innocence. You can merely introduce reasonable doubt. I mean, that's the fundamental foundation stone of our justice system, isn't it?
Well, exactly. Presumption of innocence before guilt, which
is the other one.
I think is an argument for maintaining anonymity until such time as.
But I don't think people like Stuart Hall would have been convicted at all if that was the status quo.
I can't remember enough of the details of Stuart Hall's case in terms of how many people he was supposed to have abused.
Nor can I with full detail, but I'm sure we could.
Several, right?
Yeah, we could find an example of a case that the authorities claim could not have come to court if it hadn't been for the early identifying of the accused.
The main example of this is Saville, surely, and
so he never got to court at all.
Offender.
Yes.
If he'd gone through one trial with one victim, if that was all that the prosecution had, and had been named as having been acquitted, and surely other people would have come forward and said, no, this isn't right.
But a hell of a lot more people would have come forward at the moment of his identity being made public. Jimmy Savile was today accused. Jimmy Savile was today charged with, and then the floodgates would have opened in the way that they did after his death.
So they would if he'd gone through a trial and
yes, but then we're back to but then we're back to the police and the CPS and most lawyers, not all lawyers, who would argue that you would not get, in a lot of cases, you wouldn't get to court at all because the decision on whether or not a prosecution is likely to be achieved is going to depend upon the weight of the evidence. And you're suggesting that we go to court with the lightest available evidence, and their argument is we should go to court with the heaviest available evidence, and the heaviest available evidence would involve publishing the name.
I wonder if that's as much a function of the inadequacy of police and CPS procedure.
It could be, and that brings us to some of the stories reported recently about evidence emerging in the 11th hour that made the accused clearly innocent. But that I'm not confident or comfortable with your employment of the word competence, because as I read more and more of these stories, I find myself seeing incontrovertible evidence of the impact of police cuts, but of course the right-wing newspapers aren't going to report them as the result of police cuts. They much prefer to lean towards the idea that the police are somehow incompetent and the people who've dedicated their lives to protecting the rest of us are somehow suspicious. But thank you, Nick. I mean, crikey. I told you it was a complicated one. How should our criminal justice system operate with regard to accusations of serious sexual abuse and worse? Because if it doesn't take them seriously enough, you get a grooming gang-style scandal in the north of England, or you see John Warboys facing possible release much, much earlier than anyone with a functioning conscience could allow, or at least approve of. If you take them, if you treat them as credible, if you take them seriously, and they turn out not to be true, you end up, for reasons I don't fully understand, and I don't want to speculate on it because it would be too ugly, actually, but I don't understand why a certain type of right-wing journalist, most obviously evinced on the front of the Mail and the Sun today, get so excited by these stories when accusations turn out not to be true. The fury and the anger pointed at the accuser is odd, because it's never matched by the fury and anger pointed at the abuser in other contexts. And most obviously, you will have completely different reactions to that clip I played you, and I'll play it you again, actually. A few of you have asked me to, because you can't quite believe your ears. And this, to me, we discovered it while covering Nick's accusations, this via XRO News on this programme. We discovered this clip literally while reporting on his allegations, and I still can't quite believe my ears. Tim Fortescue, Conservative whip, early 70s, under Ted Heath.
Anyone with any sense who was in trouble would come to the whips and tell them the truth and say, no, I'm in a jam. Can you help? It might be debt, it might be scandal involving small boys, or any kind of scandal which a member seemed likely to be mixed up in. They'd come and ask if we could help. And if we could, we did. And we would do everything we can, because we would store up brownie points. That sounds a pretty nasty reason, but it's one of the reasons. Is if we can get a chap out of trouble, then he'll do as we ask forevermore.
Well, there it is, you know. It's an overused and widely misunderstood word, but there is the establishment in action. And don't think that it would necessarily be any different on other sides of the House. I've told you, 33 men are set to have their accusations against the late Labour MP Greville Janner heard, and it was the work of the MP who's subsequently been on something of a nosedive, professionally speaking, but Simon Danchuk up in Rochdale, responsible for unearthing the truth about the late Liberal MP Cyril Smith. But that happens to be a Conservative whip. Ben's in Salford. We'll have another go. Ben, what would you like to say?
Hi, James. I think you're right about the tribalism part of it, and I think the answer for why people are so tribalistic about this and why you get the vitriol from the right-wing journalists and so on, it's simply this. It is a wildly complicated issue. I've made bullet points in front of me of issues that you've been talking about in the last 20 minutes that stretches to a full page of A4. Don't worry, I won't go through them. But the problem is most people like to pick a side because then they can stamp their foot and, you know, they can shout at one side or the other. Yes. I mean, you know, I see press covering of cases where I've defended, and I see, you know, the calls for lynchings and murderings and whatever underneath them. And I see the same right-wing journalism that you see on the other side.
Yes.
I think in terms of the anonymity issue, I think that's it. So I guess an MP answer, which is that there isn't a clear answer to it. But the caller you had 2 callers ago, I think, was talking about the justification for the accused not retaining anonymity up until conviction. And of course,
or acquittal.
There's a flip to that,
yes.
Or acquittal. There's a flip to that which is perhaps interesting. A defendant, of course, doesn't have the same powers of or ability to investigate the accuser that is making an attempt at accusing him. And quite often, in defending cases like this, one will encounter a defendant who says, well, you know, here I am locked up in whichever prison I'm in, and so-and-so has been to visit me, and they've said that 5 or 6 people from my neighbourhood or whatever have said that this person has made accusations about them. Once they went to the police, but the rest of the times they were just spreading their names around the area saying, oh, so-and-so's sexually assaulted and whatever else. And of course there isn't, not least of which was the lack of legal aid, there isn't any power to investigate. So you rely on a disclosure system. The disclosure system, as everyone is gathering, is broken, to say the least.
Yes.
And so I think there is an argument to say this, at least. One must have equality of arms. I don't want to put that in an adversarial sort of terminology, but that's what it is. Because if you have a justification which makes perfect sense for the naming of a defendant, then the same justification might well be a justification for naming the complainant as well. Because it is a feature to an alarming number of cases, but if you ask how many of those cases then end up with those issues being put at trial, the answer is it's a handful.
Right.
Now, that's partly because some of it's just sort of spurious gossip or whatever else, and the rest of it, and I speak from the same point of view, someone who defends in these cases, is because there is simply no way of tracking down those people who say that these accusations have been made against them too, or it certainly isn't very easy to do so. So there's that. It's a balance, and it's a difficult one to obtain. But the consequences of being the named accused are potentially catastrophic. There are cases of those who take their own lives, or at least make attempts on their own lives. I finished a case in Liverpool not long ago.
That will be true of people who are rightly accused as well, won't it?
Well, that's right.
Yes.
But this is the sort of it's the sort of whataboutism to some extent.
I suppose it is. Yes.
Yeah, and the fact is that, I mean, so I gave you research for an example of a case I just finished in Liverpool, where...
You're a barrister, are you? A criminal barrister, man?
I am.
Yes.
Yeah. A young man, 21 years old, been in custody for 5 months awaiting trial, and this was an allegation of rape that was supposed to have taken place in his bedsit. And the judge, prior to the jury starting the trial, lambasted the prosecution, saying, well, look, there's clearly undermining evidence in this case that is quite fundamental. You need to go away and have a think, which they did. But, of course, it had, as we would say in the legal profession, had the rubber stamp on it of sexual offence, which is a sign of the times in a good way, I suppose. We are taking everything very seriously, but also it can blinker,
of course,
and cause people to cover their own backsides. They came back, they prosecuted the trial. The complainant gave evidence. The defendant gave evidence. At the 11th hour, we tracked down the person who was in the flat next door at the material time, who had very important evidence to give that was fundamentally undermining. The police had spoken to him as well, which is rather troubling. Yes. And the jury acquitted in, I can't remember, but it was certainly less than an hour and a half anyway. But in that scenario, the defendant, I mean, obviously, he got his life back ultimately, but it destroyed his family. He was kicked out by family members, female family members.
I remember my first year at university, I can still remember the name of the chap at King's College. I'm not going to repeat it for the reasons that you're sort of implicitly alluding to, but I can still remember his name. And he was acquitted afterwards. The idea that you walk out of court with your reputation restored is just wrong, isn't it?
Well, it is. And so the test, though, we all talk about belief, don't we, and whether someone's believable. And this is a transition from the days of the War Boys decisions to now, perhaps, which is that, of course, believability isn't the test, and it also isn't the duty of a police officer. What is looked for now is whether there is a realistic prospect of conviction. And the fundamental point to that, and the one we perhaps ought to keep a sharper focus on, isn't whether someone is believable. It is whether there is something that is fundamentally undermining of their account. So, to be blunt, what that means realistically is there probably will be more and more cases going to court, as there are. I mean, step into any Crown Court now and you'll see it's more or less wall-to-wall sex trials of one sort or another. But the cases like the one in Liverpool, where there were objective contemporaneous messages and things like that, which clearly and fundamentally undermined the complainant's version of events.
So the authorities are looking to prove it, not to disprove it.
Precisely.
Oh, you're good.
That is a combination of lots of things. It's a cutting in police funding, it's a cutting in police training. Ask a police officer, I'm sure there are lots listening, who will compare, the years of training that they underwent.
Compared to the new generation, the new crop of cops.
And that goes down to disclosure. So when I had a cross-examined a police officer not very long ago who saw nothing at all wrong, and I genuinely think he didn't see anything wrong. I didn't think he was being bent about it. He pursued a line of inquiry which absolutely undermined it.
But without even realising, we're going to run out of time. In a sentence, then, I think I know the answer to this, but we might not have time to hear it. What would you change about the current system? Just the amount of effort that goes into disproving a position rather than proving it.
Focus on investigation.
But you mean from a defence point of view? So you almost have, if the police are the police force of the CPS, it's like the defence barristers need their own police force as well.
And legal aid till the end of that.
There we go. 11 o'clock.